Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. Our 10th festival, like thousands of other events, was no longer able to proceed due to the rapidly evolving situation around COVID-19. While our 10th anniversary is postponed, we have 9 years of stimulating dangerous ideas in the archive to ponder, reminding us of the eerily relevant conversations that take place at the festival each year. You can't imagine the people of North Africa and the Middle East want freedom and dignity, because on some level you don't see them as people like you, says journalist and activist Mona Eltahawy in this 2011 talk. In this session, Eltahawy reflects on the fight for freedom and democracy within Middle Eastern populations, oppressed under dictatorship, and urges the West to reflect upon Middle Eastern stereotypes we have created, and if we can afford to prefer Arabs as democrats rather than dictators. This is Mona Eltahawy with Hypocrisy Rhymes with Democracy.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, first of all, for having such a great title, and second of all, for inviting me to come and address you today. I'm very excited to be here in Sydney and to speak at such a great venue. I'd like to dedicate my talk today to the courageous people of the Middle East and North Africa who, against all odds, continue to rise up and defy the dictatorship and the largely international silence vis-a-vis that dictatorship, which will be the focus of my talk today. After Egyptians toppled Hosni Mubarak on February the 11th, the first international visitor to Egypt was the British Prime Minister David Cameron. He arrived in Tahrir Square to congratulate Egyptians and to say that he was very inspired by what happened. Now, we have a long and illustrious and very difficult history with the Brits in Egypt because of British colonization. And so anything that a British Prime Minister or a British official says is often perused and thought about for a very long time. And when it comes to hypocrisy rhyming with democracy, we have plenty of examples from the past. Because when Lord Cromer, for example, was the High Commissioner in Egypt at the beginning of the 20th century, he was a major crusader for Egyptian women's rights and feminism, while at the very same time, in the UK, he belonged to a union that fought tooth and nail to keep women from voting. And so this idea that a string of Western officials come to Egypt and say one thing and back home do another thing, or vice versa, it's not something alien to us. And lo and behold, when David Cameron came to Cairo and went to Tahrir Square and saluted the revolutionaries, saying, "You've inspired me," 2 days later, he went on a tour of the Gulf with about 7 to 8 British arms manufacturers to sell weapons to countries who he knew would use those weapons against anyone who similarly felt inspired by what happened to Egypt. And you fast forward to just the past 2 weeks up until today, where I'll give you a very quick kind of summary of what's been happening. The UK had its largest arms fair in the middle of September, and the Foreign Office and the Office of the Foreign Ministry and the Commonwealth, or whatever it's called, invited Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain to that largest of arms fairs, again, to sell them weapons, again, knowing what they would use those weapons for. Because in the case of Saudi Arabia, for example, we have seen weapons bought from the British, taken to Bahrain, a tiny neighbor of Saudi Arabia, where people rose up in February, inspired by what happened in Egypt. And the Saudis and their Gulf allies have been using those weapons they bought from the Brits to squash the uprising in Bahrain. The uprising was largely squashed in March. And Saudi Arabia not just uses the weapons out there, it hasn't shot at its own people yet, but what Saudi Arabia has done, and the odds against Saudis who want to rise up, was very clearly shown to us last week, when on Sunday, the Saudi king, who's usually considered a feminist and a reformist, and is in his late 80s, so he doesn't really have much time to reform anything, but he gave Saudi women the right to vote, and everybody rightfully celebrated. But very few of us stop to think, wow, they still can't vote. It's 2011, and we're celebrating something that they're just going to get in 2012, 2015, actually. It's not going to come that quickly. And he also promised that they would get a seat on the Shura Council in Saudi Arabia, which is all appointed. But then 2 days later, after Saudi women were given this great, or expressed their gratitude for this great gift from the king, a Saudi judge sentenced a Saudi woman who had dared to break the ban on driving to 10 lashings. This created a bit more of a stir on the international community, and the king, once again, the reformer and the so-called feminist, swooped in and pardoned this woman from the lashing. And so the question here is, what happens when the king isn't there anymore to pardon women from these judges who see fit to pass whatever sentences? And the question beyond that, and the question that very few of us is asking or are asking, is what's going on in Saudi Arabia and why are we supporting Saudi Arabia? And if we take that to Bahrain, back again in Bahrain, just 3 or 4 days ago, just as I arrived in Australia, a Bahraini military court sentenced Bahraini doctors and nurses to between 5 to 15 years in prison just because they treated the injured and the wounded during that uprising, which was squashed earlier this year. And the outrage over sentencing doctors and nurses just for doing their jobs is well-founded. And yet, the United States, a major ally of Bahrain, for the first time since that uprising began and was squashed, plans to sell the Bahrainis $53 million worth of weapons, knowing very well who those weapons will be used against. And the reason that the United States is going to sell these weapons to the Bahrainis, and the reason that the Brits invite my country and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and others to their arms fairs, is this word that I have come to hate and despise, and it is the word stability. Because the US Defense Department said it was selling Bahrain $53 million worth of weapons because it considers Bahrain a major non-NATO ally and a force of stability. And again, just before I arrived in Australia, the Egyptian foreign minister went to DC and met with Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, and she described our Supreme Military Council, which has ruled Egypt since Mubarak was forced to step down. They are 19 men from the military, who are all friends of Mubarak's from the military, who I call the Supreme Council of Mubaraks, because we essentially replaced one Mubarak with 19 Mubaraks. And she told this foreign minister, our foreign minister, visiting DC, that the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces is a force of, wait for it, stability and continuity for Egypt. If by that she meant it's the force of stability and continuity of the Mubarak regime, then she was absolutely right. But it's not the kind of stability and continuity that Egyptians took to the streets for. It's not the kind of status quo that almost 1,000 Egyptians paid their lives for. And it's not the kind of stability and major alliance that so many Bahrainis have risked their lives for. But in the case of Bahrain, we know that it's a major, rather than just being a major ally, it's a major buffer between the US's Fifth Fleet, Navy Fifth Fleet, and Iran, that big bogeyman of Iran. So what exactly lies behind this concept of stability? And why do these governments keep selling weapons to our dictators? And why are you largely silent? And I put it to you, my dangerous idea for you at this festival, seeing as it's the festival of dangerous ideas, is that for the people of North Africa, the Middle East and North Africa, to have freedom and dignity, that concept scares you. You don't imagine that the people in the Middle East and North Africa, you can't imagine that the people in the Middle East and North Africa want freedom and dignity. Because on some level, you don't see them as people like you. On some level, all of you, as well as your governments, who keep selling these weapons and love stability, have bought into a stereotype that has served only our dictatorships and your governments. And that stereotype is that the people of the Middle East and North Africa, now people usually say Arabs, but it's not just Arabs in that part of the world, but the people in the Middle East and North Africa are lazy, are passive, don't like freedom, like strong-fisted dictators, want to be put in their place, want to be controlled, love Saddam Hussein-type leaders, love their pharaohs like Mubarak. I mean, it makes it sound like an abused wife who can't leave an abusive marriage. But this is the stereotype that was there when the people of the region were rising up. And this is the stereotype that so many of us have been fighting for so long. Because from day one, when I was appearing on US television to try to explain what was happening, it was a stereotype that was butting my head up against over and over. Not just against the media, but against so-called experts. Because from the very beginning, if we rewind now to Tunisia, and that young man who set himself on fire in Sidi Bouzid, in central Tunisia, the young man called Mohamed Bouazizi, commonly referred to as the godfather of these amazing uprisings and revolutions in the Middle East and North Africa, when he set himself on fire, as tragic as his act was, there was no passivity in that act. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was taking control of his life, albeit to end it, because he must have known on some level that he would die. When that sparked the uprising that turned into the revolution in Tunisia, most international reaction was, where the hell is Tunisia? Because unless you were European, you really didn't know where Tunisia was, at least in North America, where I was. And we had various holidays at the time, Christmas, New Year, Hanukkah, all of that, and that stood in the way of major media coverage. So nobody really knew anything about Tunisia. But when they looked at Tunisia and they finally paid attention, the excuse for the uprising, and that's where the naysayers came in now, was that Tunisia was different. I mean, usually we talk about Arab exceptionalism, which is they're lazy, they're passive, they like their strong-armed leaders, they don't want to rise up, they love to live in tyranny. But this was now Tunisian exceptionalism, because we were told, no, Tunisia is a largely secular country, Tunisia is a largely educated country, and it's not going to happen anywhere but Tunisia. Now, those of us watching Tunisia, those of us from that part of the world, were ecstatic. Because what we saw happening, sweeping across Tunisia, was something that we have dreamt of all our lives. Because we don't buy that stereotype. Because it's the stereotype that our dictators tell your officials when they come to our capitals that keep the weapons coming. Often the excuse for the alliances between your governments and ours is oil. It's a legitimate explanation for this hypocritical foreign policy, but it's not the only one. So I urge you again to consider that stereotype. So we who do not believe in that stereotype were celebrating because we knew that what was happening in Tunisia was going to spread everywhere. And so for those who cared to ask and wondered, is it going to stop at the border of Tunisia? We said, of course not. This is amazing. This is something we knew would happen all along. Lo and behold, it happened in Egypt. And everyone who said it's not going to happen anywhere in Tunisia then started saying, well, just Egypt, because, and here all the exceptions came out again. Egypt is a large country. Egypt is a country of thousands of years of civilization, blah, 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 just excuses. So the same people who for years had been saying we couldn't rise up now had to explain why we were rising up. And yet the media kept going to those very same naysayers to ask them, can you now tell us why you've been wrong all this time? And they scrambled to explain why these people who love strong-armed dictators and who love to be tyrannized are now rising up. But again, they said, you know what, just Egypt. It's not going to go beyond Egypt. And funnily enough, the dictators were taking part in this chorus, but I can understand why the dictators in the Middle East and North Africa would say, nowhere but Tunisia, nowhere but Egypt, because for them to watch all these other old men, because they're all old men, to watch all these other old men being challenged like that by a largely youthful population, the majority of people in that part of the world is younger than 30. So for these old men to watch this amazing flourishing of uprisings and revolutions, it terrified them. So I can understand them saying, it won't happen in Egypt. I can understand them saying it won't happen in Yemen, but why would you say that? Why would your media say that? Why would your government say that? Why would you not be ecstatic at the thought that people want freedom and dignity? So again, I urge you to look at that stereotype, because the stereotype up until then had posited that the only people who could rise up against these dictators were the scary Muslim men in beards, the Islamists essentially. But the Islamists had nothing to do with the revolution in Tunisia. I'm sure a few of them took part, but it was a largely, like Egypt, leaderless revolution that did not say we want an Islamic state. When Tunisians go to the polls, they will elect the government they want, as they should. As long as those elections are free and fair, we must all respect that. But I'm talking about the revolutions. Islamists did not swoop in to rescue Tunisians from Ben Ali. And in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, that big bogeyman, that Mubarak for 30 years had always put out there in the shadows for the Americans to be scared of. And the Americans delivered. 5 different US presidents supported Hosni Mubarak because they did not want those scary Muslim men in beards to take over. But the scary Muslim men in beards did not spark the revolution in Egypt. Some Muslim men in beards took part in the revolution, yes, but the Muslim Brotherhood as a movement actually came very late to the party. They joined the revolution a few days into it. So the naysayers, again, were caught scrambling. The Islamists are not the only people who are there to rescue us from Hosni Mubarak. Why? Because that unique concept that Egyptians actually want to live lives of freedom and dignity, regardless of whether they're Muslim or Christian or atheist, regardless of whether they're scary and have beards and make you feel uncomfortable, regardless of all of those stereotypes. And then when the revolutions continued in Libya, there was another stereotype that you had to contend with. Because Libya was one of those strange countries that the West had a kind of on-again, off-again love affair with. Because for a very long time, the way that Libya was looked at was the way that Ronald Reagan defined Muammar Gaddafi, which was the mad dog of Libya. And if anything, one of the worst things that Libyans had to contend with for so long was that most of the world would look at Gaddafi as a clown. They didn't really take him seriously because he'd show up in all these outlandish outfits and his female bodyguards with their AK-47s and his tents that he would pitch everywhere. And somehow that made people think that he wasn't that much of a dictator just because he's a clown. But clowns can kill people. And Gaddafi imprisoned, filled his jails with dissidents, allowed Libyans very, very little freedoms of any kind. And for a very rich country, the fact that 1/3 of his population lived in poverty is just a sign of how unconscionable his almost 42 years of dictatorship was. So why didn't we pay attention to what was happening to Libyans? Because most of the world, your governments, and governments here include Australia, include the US, include Europe, were so busy focusing on the crimes of the Gaddafi regime against non-Libyans. So we would talk about Pan Am, and we would talk about the French planes, and we would talk about acts of terrorism that Gaddafi would sponsor and finance outside of Libya. But we would not talk about what Gaddafi did inside. Again, it's like we thought, well, he's their leader, they want him, they like something about him. And it's as if somehow they were not worthy of this idea that these people must want freedom and dignity. And it came up with Libya and then when Yemen started and Bahrain started and Syria started, where people would somehow imagine that all of a sudden, overnight, people just woke up and said, we're done. We're sick and tired of this. They would forget that for decades, Libyans have been trying to get rid of Gaddafi. They would forget that in the 1970s, he was arresting students en masse and publicly executing people on live television. And in the 1980s, sending agents to execute abroad what he called, quote unquote, stray dogs, which were dissidents of the Libyan regime, dissidents against Gaddafi. But none of this would be discussed because we were so busy focusing on Gaddafi's crimes against non-Libyans. And then when Gaddafi basically blackmailed the international community's conscience by paying reparations to the victims of Pan Am and other terrorist attacks. And then in 2003, after the Americans invaded Iraq, and Gaddafi realized nobody was scared of him anymore, and he became not just a scary clown, but just a clown, and renounced his supposed weapons of mass destruction, you could count the number of Western officials and business people that were scrambling and trying to outrun each other to go to Libya to strike deals with him, to sell him weapons that they knew very well who he would use against, just as I've shown you in the examples of Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and Egypt, for oil and gas deals. Tony Blair went to Libya with a whole host of businessmen. The French and Italian leaders laid down the red carpet for Gaddafi, and the French actually allowed him to lecture them in their National Assembly and actually give them a hard time. Actually, the French deserve a hard time on the way they treat immigrants and the way they treat people of immigrant descent generally. But it's as if Gaddafi was this human rights activist and no one stood up to him, whereas Gaddafi was not just killing Libyans, but ask black Africans how they were treated under the Gaddafi regime. And shamefully, to this day, the way they're being treated, and many revolutionaries are speaking up and saying this should not happen. So why this silence about Gaddafi? Why did Condoleezza Rice go and meet him? Why, when we knew that he massacred At least 1,000 people opened fire at 1,000 people in 1996 in Abu Salim jail and killed them all and refused to acknowledge it for years. And it was actually the mothers and the relatives of those men who were killed in Abu Salim who started the Libyan revolution. So it did not happen overnight. These were mothers and sisters and wives who for years refused Gaddafi's blood money because he tried to silence them with money and said, no, we actually want a trial and accountability. Libyans calling for accountability, my goodness. So much for the stereotype of these people not being worthy of freedom and dignity. And these women who for years have been calling for accountability from the Gaddafi regime. They demonstrated on February the 15th because an attorney who had been representing their case for their male relatives who were slaughtered in Abu Salim jail in 1996 was jailed by the Gaddafi regime. And 2 days before their demonstrations that were inspired by what was happening in the region were supposed to take part, these female relatives of these men demonstrated in Benghazi and sparked the revolution. So don't tell me that they suddenly woke up one night and said, oh my goodness, we deserve freedom and dignity. They've been trying to get freedom and dignity for years, but nobody would listen to them because unless you killed white Europeans, nobody listened to you. If you were killing your own people using weapons and making the most of money that you made with business deals with mostly white Europeans in the West, and you used all of that to kill your own people, nobody really cared. And to add insult to injury, as the Americans were scrambling to catch up with what was happening in Egypt, one thing they forgot, and many of us tried to bring up in TV interviews. I mean, I remember at the time I was being interviewed with someone who worked with the Bush administration, and she was praising to high heaven a man that Mubarak had appointed as vice president during the revolution, a man called Omar Saliman. Omar Saliman, she said, was a man who was well respected in the region. And my question was, by whom? He was respected by the Americans, he was respected by other dictators in the region, but why was he respected by the Americans? Because he ran the rendition program for them. Not only did the Americans provide and continue to provide 40% of Egypt's military budget, but Egypt did the United States dirty work because Egypt was the #1 destination for rendition for the United States. Because US law bars Americans, I'm now a US citizen, so bars my administration, from torturing people on US soil. They had to open this Guantanamo place. But also, they sent to their major allies so-called terrorism suspects to be tortured that they couldn't do back home. And Egypt, to my shame, and to the shame of many people in Egypt, but also to our outrage, was the #1 destination for rendition. And here was this former Bush administration advisor telling me that Omar Saliman was a well-respected man. Well-respected for what? For torturing people for you? For doing your dirty work? And then you dare to say that my people, our people, do not stand up to dictators? We stand up to dictators, and yet your governments send them millions and billions of dollars in aid and sell them weapons, and then also encourage them. Turn a blind eye, first of all, when they torture us, but encourage them to torture people for you. And you wonder how these dictators stayed in power for so long. The question here isn't, why didn't people rise up earlier? The question here is, how can you even wonder how these dictators stayed in power for so long when your money and your inability, your blindness to our demands for freedom and dignity allowed them to stay in power for so long? And so now, when we look at the region, and these naysayers scramble to explain why people are uprising, well, of course they're rising up. They've been trying to rise up for years, you just weren't paying attention. And now the naysayers, we are struggling to hold on to our optimism in Egypt. Today, the Supreme Military Council of Mubarak's laid down a so-called timetable for, now this, remember, is 4 or 5 days after our foreign minister met with Hillary Clinton. Do you honestly think he did not sit there and tell her, we're going to lay down a timetable for this supposed transition from military rule, the Supreme Council of Mubarak, to civilian rule? Because this is something for sure that they had discussed. And this idea of US military aid to Egypt being tied to democratic ideals, for the longest time and to this day, the US administration continues to refuse to even countenance that aid to Egypt should be held conditional to Egypt's respect, to whoever's ruling Egypt, respect for human rights, respect for a transition to civilian rule, respect for all of that. And why? Because the United States likes to keep its aid to Egypt tied to one thing and one thing only, and that one thing is how nicely Egypt plays with Israel. If Egypt stops playing nicely with Israel, it will use that to threaten it. While the rest of us, most Egyptians I know are saying, cut the aid, cut the aid. We don't want your money. We don't want your weapons. We want to be free of the Supreme Council of Mubaraks. But that Supreme Council of the military today announced a timetable for this supposed transition to civilian rule that looks way ahead until the end of next year, when it proposes presidential elections, after which it will step aside, and that's at the end of 2012. So we're looking at being ruled by a military junta until all the way up to the beginning of 2013. This is not what we had a revolution in Egypt for. And even worse, emergency law, which Egypt has been under for the past, since 1981, every year that all these weapons deals, every year that all this aid goes to Egypt, we have been under emergency law, which basically means you can be arrested anytime for no reason whatsoever, be disappeared, be tortured, all of this. The emergency law, the Supreme Military Council, the Supreme Council of Mubarak says it will study the lifting of the emergency law. I'm not really sure what there is to study, because we know very well what the emergency law has done to Egypt, because it's been doing it since 1981, and it considers possibly lifting it sometime next year, as it will study a whole bunch of other demands that have been on the top 5 list of demands since the revolution, and these demands have been mostly ignored. The ending of emergency law was one of the major demands of the revolution back in January, when Egyptians took to the streets. So again, this stereotype now, let's go back now to your stereotypes and hypocrisy, not just at the heart of your various governments and their dealings with our governments or with our regimes. Because we know oil, I've talked about weapons, I've talked about rendition and the dirty business that we end up doing for the Americans. But what do you think of the people in my part of the world? Why is it that you think we are so dangerous that if we had freedom and dignity, it would somehow upend something? What would it upend? What makes you so uncomfortable about the thought that people in the Middle East and North Africa want freedom and dignity? Is it because we're Muslims and you imagine us all with these scary beards? And if Muslims get freedom and dignity, what will happen? Will we come over here and convert you all? Will we go to the United States and force everyone to live under Sharia, which is what the right-wing nutcases in the United States claim is happening from a tiny 2.5% of the population? Muslims must be really powerful if we so captivate and hold dominant your nightmares that for wanting what you have and for wanting what you take for granted, we are constantly questioned. From the very beginning, we were told you could not do this. And then when we started to do it, we were asked, why didn't you do this before? And then as we continued to do it, people kept saying, you will fail, it will not work. I would go to all these panel discussions in New York, and the first question, as if somehow people in New York knew what was happening in Cairo better, the first question would be, are you aware of this? Are you aware of that? All these dark counter-revolutionary forces. Of course we are, but will you give us a chance to make it work? Why all this naysaying? Soon after Tunisia, when I kept seeing the same names over and over again of all these so-called experts who kept saying this is never going to happen, who kept saying, oh my God, it happened. How do we now explain that it happened? I spoke to 3 friends of mine, an Egyptian journalist who works for the Financial Times, a Mauritanian anti-slavery activist who lives in the United States under political asylum, and a Syrian poet and human rights activist. And I said to them, what is this? What's going on? Why all this naysaying? Doesn't it piss you off? Because it really pisses me off. And they said, you know, it's really funny. For so many decades now, we're told, why aren't you people democratizing? Why aren't you people more democratic? Why aren't you people fighting for freedom by the very same countries that were strengthening what I call our papas? Because one of the major ironies for us is Mubarak and Omar Salman and the king of Saudi Arabia in his 80s, and the king of Bahrain, also very old, and Gaddafi, who was kind of young, you know, relatively, 67, and all these other old men, you know, they were the papas of the Middle East and North Africa. And what happened to these big daddies was they felt that the rug was literally pulled out from under their feet by the kids. They'd never taken these kids seriously. The majority of their population are basically the kids. And yet we had the Obama administration, and Obama himself, who so galvanized young people in the United States, young people across the world actually, Obama, who made so many young people across the world, but especially in the United States, fall in love with politics again. Obama, who had sent more young Americans to the polls than we had seen in decades, Here we saw Obama struggling to catch up and understand what's happening. And here we saw Obama and his various officials, be they the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, whatever secretary he has in his administration. Here we see them taking the side of the big daddies, taking the side of the old men standing in the way of our freedom and dignity. And my Egyptian friend, who works for the Financial Times, she said, you know, they would keep pointing to these countries and saying things like, but their economies are doing so great. Egypt was often listed on all these lists of emerging economies that you should invest in. None of that trickled down to ordinary Egyptians. Ordinary Egyptians were killing each other in bread lines, in bread queues a few years ago during the food crisis, 3 or 4 years ago, because none of this fabulous wealth was trickling down to us. Instead, it was going to Big Daddy and his son, because as well as all these old men ruling us, they had their sons and their son-in-laws all lined up to inherit us. This is another reason that we rose up in Egypt, because we didn't want to be inherited by these sons. But these sons fed into another stereotype. This is where the sons came into the stereotype now, with the hypocrisy rhyming with democracy thing. Because all of a sudden, these supposedly democratic governments dealing with our dictators somehow proclaimed these young men, the sons and the sons-in-laws of our big daddies, as great hopes. They were the great white hope. Why were they great white hope? Why were they our great hopes? Because they were educated in the London School of Economics, because one of them, the Syrian dictator, was an ophthalmologist in Damascus, because they wear suits and they speak English, and their wives are glamorous and they wear Jimmy Choos. And Vogue magazine, much to its shame, had a multiple-page spread interviewing and profiling one of these fabulously glamorous Jimmy Choo-wearing first ladies, Asma Assad. They interviewed her and her husband, and they published this profile in the middle of the Tunisian revolution. And what did she tell? What did glamorous Asma al-Assad tell Vogue magazine? She told them, we run our house in a very democratic way. Our children get to choose, they get to elect every morning what cereal they eat. And we thought, how lovely for the Assad children. If only they extended this wonderful democracy to the rest of Syria. And so you had all these sons, brutes, the sons of dictators, who would not subject us to anything but dictatorship. But because Saif al-Islam Gaddafi wore sharp suits and invited Mariah Carey and Beyonce for concerts that they got $1 million each for, and waxed lyrical like a philosopher, you bought the crap that he was somehow going to represent democracy. And that's what my Syrian friend told me. He said to me, they just don't think we're capable of doing this. They don't believe that we have it in us to be free. So I ask you, because I want to wind it up now, because I'd love to get into that. My question to you, before you ask me anything, my question to you is, what is it that makes you and your governments and your media so uncomfortable to the point of fear of my people being free, of my people having freedom and dignity, basically of my people living lives just like yours? I ask this, but I remind you that we will not stop in our fight for freedom, because as much as the Supreme Council of Mubarak's continues to stand in our way, as much as Assad continues to slaughter people and pull out the vocal cords of a non-violent activist and send them to his family and say, make shawarma out of them, as much as the Saudis sentence their women to be lashed just for driving, and a whole bunch of bullshit cultural relativism is used to justify it because it's their culture and we must be quiet. Well, we're not being quiet, and it's not our culture, because we didn't determine this is our culture. The old men, the big daddies determined it was our culture. Despite all of this, despite Bahrain sending to jail doctors and nurses, and despite the weapons that your governments continue to sell to our big daddies to keep us down, we will be free. Thank you.
This session was recorded live at the Sydney Opera House and presented by the Sydney Opera House and the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of our life. We offer free counselling for individuals, consulting, leadership and development services. As a non-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations to continue our work, which can be made via our website.